Out of the Super Nintendo Final Fantasies, 5 is usually seen as the middle child. It doesn't represent an artistic shift like 4, and it doesn't reinvent the wheel like 6. Not helping things is how the first translation the West got for the game, the PS1 version, was really bad. This, along with a plot that's juggling around several different ideas, caused that particular aspect to receive a lukewarm reception, with some going as far as to call it bad. Not just worse than 6 and 4, bad. While thoughts have definitely calmed down, the game's story is still a key reason why it can't compete with the likes of 6, 7 and 9 whenever fan polls are conducted. Upon replaying the game for ourselves, we found that the story is actually very layered in 3 distinct areas. An understanding of these will hopefully get some of you to realise why the narrative turned out the way it did. A question which has been bugging some corners of the fanbase is of whether or not Final Fantasy V was a satire of genre tropes at the time. The Game Boy Advance retranslation's zany direction is probably what leads the audience to this conclusion. The reason is often used to defend its story in comparison to 4's, with the rebuttal that, like Narum and Birdemic, this logic is a shallow attempt at dodging criticism. In a self-righteous attempt at answering the question, I'll say that the word the fanbase is searching for is deconstruction. Satire refers to holding up shortcomings through the use of ridicule, whereas deconstruction involves questioning concepts for examination. Final Fantasy V is a humorous game for sure, but its narrative and gameplay content suggest more of an examination than an attempt at ridicule. The crystals, for example, are deemed sacred treasures in the previous entries, and you probably like eating babies if you even think about taking them away, and I'm not talking about jelly babies. Meanwhile, Final Fantasy V asks, aren't the citizens of the world getting a bit greedy with these trinkets? Take the fire crystal at Karnak. When you enter the city, the benefits of exploiting the crystal are all the rage, and it's easy to understand why that is. The newest weapons and armour are useful for the upcoming dungeons and boss fights, and they arrive at the right time to test out some of your new jobs. Right away you're noticing the crystal's benefits during customization as well as within the game's lore. However, you're also on a mission to save the world from its decay, and this decay is caused by the crystal's weakening state, so you're essentially caving into the base of the problem. In any other RPG, you'd need to treat these treasures with the highest level of respect that's possible, and the town that was entrusted with them will collapse if they lose it. However, while Karnak is part of the problem, things aren't all sunshine and daisies without the crystals, as prices of the items will bump as a result of the limited supply. Despite your efforts to save the world, you still have to suffer the consequences that your heroic actions have caused the townsfolk. While you aren't the ones responsible, you do end up helping to make things concrete. Even though the game made you think about how people actually use these items, the situation still isn't completely black and white. The battle system is also re-examined. Several of the new classes will shake up how you interact with aspects that were uniform to the genre. Blue mages will make you want to be hit by attacks so that you can learn them for yourself. We'll get more onto that later. Chemists repurpose your more obsolete healing items, and samurais encourage you to save money not for the shops, but to lob at opponents for what's probably a little too much damage. But what's arguably the most interesting deconstruction is with weapons. More specifically, I'm thinking about the choice that you have at more in the merged world. A sword that's stronger if you fight, or a knife that's obscene if you run away enough times. The appropriately named chicken knife. Created by game designer Hiroyuki Ito, the director Hironobu Sakaguchi has gone on to describe this as his favourite event, and that he wanted this approach to content in future titles. I can definitely see why. The choice highlights a mechanic that players take for granted. By shifting the idea of running from a convenience to a stat along with the likes of magic and speed, the player will be caught off guard and will have to rethink their approach to random encounters so that they can include these weapons in their builds. Regardless of whether they want to be awarded for briefly taking on foes or knowing their limits, they'll be reconsidering the running mechanic in a way that they would never have dreamt of in any other RPG. It's small moments like these that make you reconsider what's already in place rather than laugh at how strange they are when taken out of context. If the amount of footage I recorded is anything to go by, Final Fantasy V is a rather long game. According to interviews with Katase, the scenario grew so much over the course of development that he had to step in as co-writer alongside Sakaguchi. In a lot of ways, I believe his contributions might be a reason why some fans believe V's story is a parody. This is because he chose to incorporate some moderate doses of comedy relief, deeming the original scenario as relatively serious. While the game's more humorous than its predecessors, this doesn't mean that the story as a whole is bad, nor does it mean it's a satire. On the contrary, the humour helps spice up what's actually a rather mundane cast of characters. Just look at this affinity chart if you want an idea of how, for the lack of a better word, bland the character relationships are compared to its predecessor. A good example of what you're going to get is when Bartz, who's written as a typical chosen hero, laments to Lenna that he saved her as he felt the wind calling to him to do so. This is a rather sappy line that's rather commonplace throughout fantasy. However, this is quickly interrupted by Galuf, who correctly assumes that Bartz's motivation was to woo the princess. Does it poke fun at a cliche? Yes. But at the heart of this exchange is humorous banter that injects personality into the cast members. Now, a massive problem I have with Katase is his penchant for spectacle, something that bleeds into his later works. In some entries, this is neutered by him working alongside Sakaguchi and other members of the team. However, in this game, he described his relationship with Sakaguchi in a more competitive light, often trying to come up with scenes that would top his. While this was clearly a light spot of friendly rivalry, there are times when this mindset shows up for the worse. The start of the merged world is a good example of this. I've no knowledge on who wrote what scenes, but it feels to me that Sakaguchi wrote the parts when Bartz and Cryo were chilling out on Boko. Why? Because the scene's pretty much a revamp of the dance party that occurred during Final Fantasy II, which was also directed by Sakaguchi. It feels to me that he chose to recreate the scene to focus on the friendship between Bartz and Cryo. They have a play fight. Bartz takes her on Boko, and they even get stuck facing an antlion where the player has to get them to work as a team. It's a short yet sweet section that allows the player to take in the raid on Exdef's castle, whilst interacting with the themes of the narrative in subtle ways. Unfortunately, what follows it are info dumps regarding how the merged world came about, which culminates in a Dragon Ball-esque duel between the evil warlock Exdef and a talking turtle. This feels to me like Katase saw the previous scene, thought it was too slow going, and decided to speed things up by cramming a ton of information onto the player, while spicing it up with a flashy fight sequence that's shown for a cutscene as opposed to gameplay. Said fight scenes are even integral to the plot, nor does it tie back into either of the central themes. Katase accomplished a lot during his career at Square, but his failings were apparent right from his first real contribution to the series, and later entries demonstrate that he wanted to take the franchise in a direction that favoured style over substance from the start. Final Fantasy V is not a satire, for better for worse. While this allows the humour to strengthen the characters rather than mock the genre's conventions, it also means that several of the more outlandish scenes were played straight, causing them to feel like a thoughtless mess. Another defence that could be used for the story is that it's a framing device for the job system. The first world in particular seems to give off this idea. Most of the core plot amounts to the group finding the crystals, only for them to break and give them new classes to try out. If the game was more plot driven, then the structure would wear thin very quickly, and the audience would understandably be turned off. Fortunately, it's clear that what the player is getting out of the ordeal is a carefully chosen palette of classes. Since you're given a variety of physical and magic-based classes with each crystal, it's not as if they're handed out willy-nilly. The developers probably wanted to freshen the experience by having the selection become more gimmicky as you progress. For example, the classes from the first game in the first batch, putting the player in a brief comfort zone. Although the second batch is the unorthodox Mystic, which uses spells to enhance physical moves. The third batch offers the Beastmaster that lets you use random opponents as allies, and the last slot is the aforementioned Chemist. For every crystal, the player will be dedicating their time to learning about how the wild card works, and the kinds of abilities that they synergise well with. Because of the amount of care the developers put into designing and placing the classes, I believe the gamble to put the story at the backseat paid off. Those who wanted more of a story don't have it all banned though, mainly because the second world doesn't give any new jobs to experiment with, meaning the narrative has more room to become more interesting. Instead of going from crystal to crystal only for it to shatter due to the group's tardiness, you're given some more backstory for both the group and the crystal itself. The recurring villains are also given a bit more time to shine, whereas the first one mainly utilised monsters of the week like Kree did. Because the game has given you almost all of the classes, it can now put more focus towards the story concept. Those who lean more on the gameplay side of the spectrum will still find more satisfaction from the experience, no. While the story crowd might only get engaged by the second world, the gameplay crowd will get to use this section to try out job combinations and test their skills against the smartly designed bosses. It's not as though they'd think a different world means that the game has instantly become a novel. While the game won't be as fulfilling for those who prefer the force more story-based approach, it's also worth respecting that the job system's at the forefront here. Therefore, the quality of the game's structure should probably hinge on it rather than decisions made when executing what's meant to be a framing device. The setting was also designed to service the job system. This becomes apparent once the world is merged towards the end of the narrative. What once filler dungeons in Bartz's world become keys to achieving invaluable prizes. Jackhole Cave is a good example of this. It felt like a throwaway dungeon that amounted to housing the Skull Eater, a difficult enemy at that point in the game. If they explored it, the player would just find themselves at a dead end. If you came back after the merge though, you will arrive at what was also a seemingly useless area, that being the Castle of Baal's basement, which is mostly blocked off during your time at Galuf's world. Here, Jackhole Cave will take you to the other side of the barricade, which houses the Odin summon. In this case, you're rewarded both for exploration and keeping previous locations in the back of your mind with a powerful ability for the summoner class. But surely one would ask, how do you do this without a guide? Simple, you're told to do this by Guido. To learn how to stop Hexdeath, he and the scholars merge half of a tome from the Library of the Ancients, and another half from Zazet's castle, two areas from completely different worlds. At this point, the player would think, wow, if pieces between universes can be merged, just think what other things could be fixed. While it's genius level design, it doesn't just make you feel smart, but rather it guides you towards tools that will allow you to master the job system, as the Odin example clearly demonstrates. But what's a universe without its ecosystem? In previous Final Fantasy games, the enemies just existed to get in the way. In this game though, while you don't get to learn what flavour they like their tea, they have unique characteristics that service the job system. These come in the form of their abilities. Some opponents have unique attacks that aren't available in stores, Arrow from Moldwind being a good example. If you use the blue mage class now, and get hit by this attack, they'll learn how to use it for themselves. This reinvents the relationship you have with the mobs in a way that services the job system, as you're rewarded for paying attention to the game with abilities that more impatient players will miss. Not only that, but there are some enemies with small stories to tell. The Golem in Drakenvale is harmless when you first run into it, running from the party upon sight, but further into the dungeon it will be attacked by other mobs. If you remember that it did nothing to you, and choose to target the mob instead, you're rewarded with an extremely useful summon that blocks several physical attacks, including those from the upcoming boss. Outside of summons, the Magic Urn in Phoenix Tower during the endgame is another opponent that involves a favour rather than a fight. Here they want you to feed them an elixir. Looks like I lied about that too. If they're fed, they'll reward you with 100 AP, which is brilliant if you haven't mastered the investment classes yet. Lore is all fine and well, but by the end of the day, Final Fantasy V is a game. The world has to be interesting from a gameplay perspective first, and level design along with an ecosystem that exists to serve the core mechanics are ultimately what keep fans invested into V's universe. While stated early in 5's more gameplay focused than its predecessor, it certainly doesn't mean it's devoid of themes, not in the slightest. One theme players have caught on to is that of legacy. All the party members come back to it in some way or form. They do this not only as the Warriors of Light who need to continue the work of the Warriors of Dawn, an idea that's captured rather unsubtly by the names, but also as part of their individual motivations. Bartz travels the world with his chocobo because that's what his father, who happened to be a Dawn Warrior, wished for on his deathbed. Lenna and Faris take this a step further. Not only do they need to carry the burden of their father Alexander Highwind Tycoon, something that Faris eventually does when she learns of her heritage, but they can also use deceased animals that they were close to as summons. Lenna can use her Windrake Karyu as the Phoenix summon, while Faris can use her faithful companion Sildra. Not only do these let you see them live on for yourself, but it also sparks ideas for builds. Those invested into the characters might want both sisters to use the summon ability so they can emphasise the theme for themselves. While they don't have to, in fact some might say it's suboptimal, what's important is that the option to mix the classes based on lore is there and ready. Forcing them to use these abilities will make the theme too on the nose, but forbidding them from doing so would have put these additions to waste. I'm beating about the bush now. The best use of this theme is definitely Galuf's last stand at the Forest of Moor. This moment is shocking as your party members always stuck with you in the job-based entries. Because you spent a long time customising and getting to know Galuf, his death initially leaves you empty and wondering how you'll cope with a blank spot in the party. Fortunately, his granddaughter Cryer will inherit everything that was invested previously, negating the worry of starting a new project this late into the journey. This sounds like a cop-out that cheapens an important character moment, but it flows naturally within the narrative considering how the other team members also have to deal with the loss of someone or something close to them. Because Cryer is willing to continue Galuf's plight to stop X-Death no matter the cost, it works thematically for her to finish working on the job classes which her grandfather started. How effectively they worked both the concept of passing a legacy and the relationship between these two characters into the battle system makes this easily one of, if not the most memorable sequence in the game, to an extent where some fans go as far as to claim that some of the later character deaths just cannot compare. Unlike Final Fantasy IV, which has a core theme of powers and everything, fans often debate about what Five's one is out of legacy or friendship. What's most important isn't defined, but both are implemented extremely well. The power of friendship is often considered a tired trope within the genre, but Five weaves it into both the story and the gameplay with flying colours. The job system ties back to it in two ways. Firstly, the player has to craft a team of 4 characters that can synergise well with each other. This can be done in numerous ways outside of just having 2 brawlers and 2 mages, thanks to the number of abilities that are available. The synergy between the thief and the time mage is a good example of this. Five has several bosses that carry rare steals, though they'll also have a common item that nobody really wants. If the boss doesn't have the steal you want, the Time Mage can just use the reset ability which takes you back to the start of the fight. This will also reset the item that the boss has to be stolen, which saves copious amounts of time on the player's end. Another way Five incorporates it is through the relationship between the classes used on one character. This is implemented by having the character learn abilities on the class once they have enough ability points. These abilities will be hardwired onto them, meaning that they can use them with other classes, which can bypass the weakness of a job that they've moved on to. For instance, while a blue mage can wield swords, they can't use them nearly as well as a knight as they specialise more in magic. If the blue mage uses the two-handed ability from a knight though, they can deal high damage on both ends of the spectrum. Not only can the job system form a relationship between the party members, it can also form one within the same character. 4 flirted with incorporating the theme into its game design, but 5 uses it as the crux of its combat. 5 also works friendship into the narrative with more finesse than its cynics let on. While friendship's taken for granted in most JRPGs, 5 tackles it in surprisingly subtle ways. This is demonstrated when Galuf returns to his homeworld, which prompts Bartz, Lenna and Faris to fight several bosses so they can go there to help him with the X-Death problem. They're even willing to give up several aspects of their lives that are dear to them just to aid him. But when they do end up in his world, and ironically needing his help in the process, they can't explain why they did all this. In any other game, this will be the moment where the group deliver a sappy speech about love, friendship, yada yada yada. Here, they know that Galuf knows, and that's all there is to it. It's subtle, but it shows how careful the team was when approaching this theme. Friendship is also emphasised by the soundtrack, which plays the main melody when the group head for Galuf's world, which is the game's way of telling you how important the scene is, not just because you're going to a new world, but also because you're helping out a friend in need. Individual members of the cast have their own ways of coming back to this theme, with Faris' childhood friend Sildra coming back from the grave to help her as a summon, and Gilgamesh sacrificing himself against Necrophobe after several battles with him, where he forms a sort of kinship with the party. Even the rather unpopular villain X-Death works by serving as the antithesis to this theme, with him being a collection of evil spirits and all. Thus, he can't comprehend positive thoughts like friendship, as demonstrated during Galuf's sacrifice, where he can't figure out why he's going to such lengths for reasons that aren't hatred or anger. Again, Galuf doesn't need to explain this, as the audience can understand through the gameplay mechanics, where he refuses to give up on his friends even when his HP's at 0. While there aren't as many character examples as in 4, 5 still builds both the story and the gameplay around a central theme, which should always be the core of your narrative. Back to the starting question though. Does Final Fantasy V have a bad plot? My answer is a resounding no. Sure, there are plenty of outlandish moments, thanks to Katase getting a little wrapped up in some friendly competition, but the narrative deconstructs several genre cliches whilst having a sense of humour to add some sizzle to the cast members. While it's most certainly not the reason why fans do 4-job Fiesta runs, I don't believe Square ever intended it to be the focus. It's simple, but it doesn't take the spotlight away from an expertly crafted job system. What the story does do, though, is execute its themes no less effectively than 4 did. While it definitely lacks depth in the series lauded for its plotlines, I think it's too hasty to brush it off as a failure when there's so much material to ponder on. Perhaps give it another go with some of our points in the back of your mind. Maybe you might realise why the game's no less a Final Fantasy than the other installments. As you could tell, we were experimenting on a new take for the channel. Rather than the two of us delving into different topics, we decided to laser focus on a single subject to make for something more nuanced. I mean, if we wanted to tackle more subjects, then we should probably devote separate reports for them. Either way, no, please leave a comment, share this with your friends, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed what you saw. Thank you for watching.